there was this woman seated in between two tables with a box of jewelry, necklaces, earrings, and the like. And I began to look at the jewelry and purchase it, and I was really awed with her work, her beadwork. And I began to have a conversation with her, and I said, well, where do you live and what do you do? And she proceeded to tell me a very extreme story about how she had 4 children at home, and she was, you know, a single parent. And I'm just looking at her, and I already recognized that she has a performance capability about her, because I knew she was lying. Joyce Scott is extremely accomplished academically because, of course, she is an alum from Mica. But then she went on to do her master's degree, her MFA, at the Institute Allende in Mexico. She also would sing in the local taverns. She is multilingual. I remember once, when I say multilingual, languages that you know, languages that you don't know, and languages that she will make up. I remember.
Is Ebonics a language, Leslie?
I have to tell you that one day I'm sitting on the front step of my house, and this is before I had my son. She is the godmother of the north of my son, and my son has a godmother from the south, and then he has another godmother from the north. But one day I see Joyce walking down the street, and I'm sitting on the front step, and my husband and I are sitting there, and he says hi to Joyce, and I said, you know her? Well, he's an alum of Mica. They were all in school together. And from that point on, Joyce and I became fast friends, much to the distress of my husband at the time. We got into lots of trouble. Today, we are known as part of a group that Joyce founded called the Girls of Baltimore. There are 6 of us. Most of them are alums of Mica. I'm an employee of Mica. But what happens is that we work on collaboratives together. Joyce Scott has gone on to win more prizes than I can possibly imagine. The Tiffany Award, Anonymous was a woman, all kinds of National Endowment Awards. What was the most recent one you were in New York right before Christmas?
The USA Arts Fellowship.
The USA Arts Fellowship. She has just returned not a month ago from having received an Artist in Residence Fellowship in Venice, Italy, on the island of Murano, where she was blowing glass with the Glass Masters, and just opened a show last night at the Museum of Art and Design. Those of you who were here for the lecture that I did with Lowry Sims week before last, where we talked about the Global Africa Project, Joyce Scott was one of the premier artists in what Roberta Smith has called a bead artist extraordinaire. This is my friend, my sister, our alum, an artist that you need to know, be proud of, because she is of our community, and I take no more responsibility for the rest of what will come out of her mouth. Joyce Jane Scott.
Thank you. We can put... And I will always love you. I will always love you. That's my homage to Whitney Houston. I start with that because she's yet one bright light, one very talented person who is lost to us. And I come from a generation before her who could have gone down a similar road, but because my parents believed in me, and because of schools like the Maryland Institute College of Art, I've had the ability to live my dream and get new dreams and live them. Now, I have to start by saying that I usually don't actually get into my bed until 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock at night, probably not asleep until 3. So this is very, very early in the morning for me. Now, around 5 minutes, I'll warm right up. But let's start now. Let's just talk about my past. I love talking about me. This is the images of my mother, Elizabeth Caldwell Calford Scott, and my father, Charlie Scott Jr., and I when we were all young. My father's parents, Charlie Scott Sr., and they would say Charlie, not Charlie. Charlie Scott Sr. and Mamie Scott from Brightleaf and Wake County in North Carolina were my father's parents. My grandparents did a form of folk art. My grandfather, evidently, these are the stories because I couldn't get many answers about him from my family because he had blonde hair and blue eyes. So they were like, really? Did he? I said, you live with him. You don't know what color his hair was? Okay, somebody's hiding something. He supposedly would make boats and canoes and carve them, and his wife, Mamie, was a quilt maker. Now, when I look at her quilts, I think of the improvisational spirit that made these happen. I can hear her la la da ba da singing the blues or Lord, 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 some kind of hymn. She would take traditional things like the log cabin and the flying geese and you name it, and she would put her own special form of writing upon them. Now, when people look at this work, they say, oh, I know what that is. That's African American art, as if there's only one form of art, but I know what they mean. When maybe they're thinking about kente cloth, the ubiquitous, politically correct cloth that's woven in Ghana. Everybody wears it. You know, it was originally woven on very, very primal looms on the ground by men, and as they would weave, they would imbue that fiber with the spirit from within. Yeah, 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 yeah. And even though there was a form to it, many of the images were improvisational. They'd be placed together and they'd become these wonderful strip garments. And so you can see how my grandmother's laid strips together, but each one of them is different. And I can hear her humming. And then there's my mother's father, Samuel Caldwell. He has many jobs as he had children. He had 14 children, so this poor brother worked all the time. They used to call him Bandy Leg because he was in some kind of accident, and you see he's kind of bow-legged. My grandfather worked for the railroad. He was a musician. He raced horses. He was a sharecropper. He was a ceramicist, and he was a quilt maker. This is a quilt that he made for me. I only met him maybe once or twice when I was just an infant. And when you look at that again, you can think about the kente cloth or the kind of strip weaving or the strip quilting that you've seen. Now, when my grandmother and grandfather wanted to dye fabric, they didn't go to the art store. They had to like wade in the water, children, and get some yellow ochre clay and boil it with that fabric. There's a syncopation to this. I'm showing you this quilt that's tattered because quilts are pages on top of pages. And so you have an old quilt, you don't throw it away. You use it as batting. Sometimes they put newspaper in it, and that would show how old the quilt is. I'm a writer too, and I wrote a long thing, which I can't remember now, but it was partially a monologue about my grandfather, because my mom said that when he'd be coming home, because he'd have to walk a long way from where he'd be dropped off, but when he'd be coming home after working on the railroad, they would see this guy with these bow legs really, really far down the road. And he'd have 14 pair, maybe 16 pair of shoes tied to him, hanging off of his arm. Any other kind of appliances, brooms, and whatever they didn't make. And his pockets will be filled with peppermint and other kinds of candy. And as he was walking toward them, they saw this kind of generous Santa Claus. And they jump on him and pull off the shoes, because you wanted to get the pair of shoes that fit you, because if you were the last one, you had to accept no matter what your toes said. And they jump on him and grab all the candy off him and eat it and kiss him and give him a sticky face and give him that kind of love for coming home. His wife, Mary Jane Caldwell, I'm named after her, Joyce J, was also a quilt maker, and she's the person who had these 14 children, so she wasn't sharecropping very much in the field. And this side of my family were sharecroppers for cotton. I also continue the family's tradition of picking cotton. When I go to Nordstrom's or Bendel's, I always get the very best cotton fabric. And guys laugh at that. Is that too sophisticated for you? That's a very nice joke. You better wake up. If I'm awake, you're awake. They turn the lights out. No, wake up. That's a very good joke. That's a kind of Seinfeldian joke. Hey, you know about the buttons? And my father's side of the family were basically tobacco. These are real sharecroppers. My mother's side of the family, they actually lived on land that was the land or close to the land that their slave ancestors picked cotton on. My mother knew her grandfather, who was an ex-slave, and he taught them how to do all kinds of basket weaving. And this is my mother, Elizabeth Caldwell Talford Scott, who was a nationally known quilter who passed away last year at the age of 95. My mom was my first inspiration. People say, when did you start making art? I say I was an artist in vitro. When I left the womb, my placenta was the most fabulously designed placenta possible. And people say, well, when did you start doing comedy? I know. When I was coming out of the womb, I was like this. A funny thing happened to me on the way out of the womb. Any of you nurses from out of town? Take my wife, please. Take my mom, please. You know, so. Now, why am I this imp? Because both my parents were. This quilt that you see is the 50-year quilt. My mom started working on this as a young child. My mom's family, now think of this, 14 people lived in a log cabin. A one-room cabin, the bathroom and the kitchen are off to the back. So when they wanted to quilt, they couldn't have a large quilt frame set up. They had a quilt frame that they would heist or hoist to the top of the building, and then they would lower it lap height, and they'd quilt. And they'd have giant quilting bees, and all the kids would use the quilt as a tent, and they'd go under it, and they'd be making their small samples, and they'd listen to all the stories, and sometimes they'd get stuck, and they'd have to send the needles back up. But boy, she talked about this being an amazing kind of Oz land where they learned a lot, you know, and a lot of gossip, too, about relatives. But she started making this quilt, and eventually I also helped her work on it. My mom was truly a visionary artist in the best, I mean that in the best possible way. She was someone who did not believe you had to be tethered by artificial ideas about what good art is. So her quilts and her wall hangings were festooned with buttons and beads and rocks and all kinds of threads and you name it. She wanted them to be lively. The piece on your right is a prayer cloth. You would put that on you when you were sick or on the back of a chair and sit against it and pray, or it would facilitate some kind of healing. And the piece on the left is owned by the Delaware Museum. It's called Grandpop's Cabin. When you look under that kind of triangular white plastic shape, there are snakes running under there. My mom said every year in their cabin, a snake would come and knock on the door at shedding time. And her father would kick the door open, boom, shoot out with a shotgun, and there'd be nothing left on the front but the snake's old skin. And they would hang the snake skins up to count how many years that snake had had Congress with them. Then there's me, Joyce J. Scott. Then there's I should be grammatically correct, even though it's too early for me. I started at the Maryland Institute of Art in 1966. This is the first time I ever said when they still were log cabins, and I think it's very funny that I'm the first slave who ever graduated from Mica. I'm sure Lazarus now is like, please don't tell people that ever again. Make me sing a Negro spiritual. Nobody knows. Speaking of Negro spirituals, I was watching one of those obtuse kind of cable channels about like Eastern European men on a prison ship, right? Now, I don't know why people watch these programs. I was surfing and I saw this. And during their breaks, these are very Eastern, like Serbian, Croatian guys. I mean, since everybody comes from Africa, the people walked from Africa to Croatia and must have left immediately. Because there's like, just like white hair, white skin, white eyes, just white and whiteness. White shirts, white boat, white guitar. On the break, the guys start singing the blues. This is the absolute truth. And the other guy starts singing, "Nobody knows the trouble." I said, oh man, a Negro spiritual on a prison ship in Eastern Europe. Now, that's powerful. African Americans must be very powerful if that can happen. One of my teachers here in probably 1966, 1967, told me to stop painting for my own personal embetterment and the actual embetterment of the entire human race. I told him that years later at one of my receptions of my aunt, and he said, I never said that, and I said, oh, yes, you did. Well, him saying that meant that I stopped wanting to be a painting major and I became an education major, and that meant I got to learn everything because I was supposed to teach it. Of course, during my student teaching, I realized if I decided to be a teacher in the public school system, I would be a 700-pound alcoholic, so I did not. You're laughing, but I meant it. I was 20, and when the kids are doing things to each other at the locker sexually that you haven't ever seen in a Renoir painting or anything, maybe you shouldn't be teaching them. Maybe you need a little bit more life lesson yourself. Getting this undergraduate degree in education allowed me to learn a lot about different techniques, especially crafts. So at the end of this student teaching, when I realized that I wasn't going to be a teacher, I did what any self-respecting hippie would do. I went to Mexico with some other art friends, and we lived there. And we luckily got to San Miguel Allende, where Mica used to have, a jewelry summer class when they were beginning their graduate department. And I got my graduate degree there in crafts. That meant I wove and did more metal work and a lot of stitching. I realized that I was just trying to replicate what my mom had taught me. My mother was my first teacher. She was the first one to teach me beadwork, sewing, weaving, carding, all the things that I learned later on in college. I said, Mom, were you a weaver? She said, no, but we would take the fibers that were left over, the short hairs of the cotton, and we would card it. Maybe we card it with some other fiber. Then we would hand spin it. Now remember, I worked on a spindle. She hand spin it into a fiber, and then we would crochet it into booties and into sandals because it was so warm, and we only had one good pair of shoes, that we'd wear these shoes that we made throughout the year unless we were going to church or some wonderful function. Wow. This is some of my molar work. After I left graduate school in Mexico, I went throughout Central America, not everywhere, Central America, South America. I went to Asia, Africa, Europe, the Pacific. I'm just really looking for me and the techniques that my mom taught me. I realized that later. So I went to a series of islands off the coast of Panama, where the Kuna Indians live. They are supposedly the second shortest people in the world, and I know the textile people here know this technique that we call mola work. It's also called reverse applique, and mola is not really the name of the technique, it's the name of the blouse that these folks wear. Now, they more and more are doing political work, but at the time they were doing very, very geometric patterns. And think about people being on an island the size of this room, very small, with bright, bright colors resonating in the sun. It was really quite amazing. They laughed at me, and I laughed at them. I was a weaver for a very, very long time. I wove off everything. The thing about being in graduate school in Mexico is that they had someone warp your loom for you. I mean, after you warp the loom, you know why they call it, because that's what happens to you when you warp a loom. And this will really make you a 700-pound alcoholic, may I add, too, if you want to do anything that's larger than a 3 by 3 inch. That sounded like a sexual position, sorry. You always get people to laugh when you throw sex in. I can even say like dog. That sounds like, oh man, she's so funny. Okay. I saw you, sir. I realized that weaving was a way for me to deal with color and texture, and it feels really great when you're doing it, but I remember being a hippie, kumbaya, wanted to deal more and more with translucency, and light would bounce off the surface and be absorbed into the surface of weaving. But what I really, really wanted to do more of was beadwork, and the beadwork that I'd done before was either sewing into fabric or working on yet another loom, which meant you had to deal with warp threads. In 1976, the bicentennial year of this country, I went back to Haystack Mountain School of Crafts, and I'm going back this year to teach in August. They do have scholarships. I'm teaching a class called Humorous Beadwork. While I was there, a Native American friend taught me the peyote stitch. No, you don't have to do peyote to learn how to do this. The reason why it's called peyote, I was told, is because the peyote bulb has little dots on it that fall on a diagonal, and the peyote stitch is also called diagonal weave. When I first started, of course, I did what all artists do. I put everything, including the kitchen sink, in this artwork, and I realized I was making these fabulous things, and oh, you can always tell how old my slides are by my hairstyles and how many chins I have. These are obviously very old images. They were lyrical, they were narrative, they were fabulous, they were thread and wire and photographs and metal. And every time I did them, I realized that I had to start from scratch because I really was not mastering the art of beadwork. I started taking out other materials and just trying to learn how to do the beadwork. And I was always still giving some kind of social or political idea to the work. This is about a woman who's been killed by the guy in the blue shirt. He tried to cover up with leaves. You can see his hands and mouth are covered with blood, but before he could get away, people saw him. This fits on your body so that the pursuers are on one part of the shoulder and running across, and the felon or the evil person is on the other side trying to get away. Piece on your left is called Chalk Marks. It's about a little girl in a smiley face dress that's been murdered. A woman finds her and her teddy bear, and the police come and draw chalk on everything. That piece and the piece next to it, Spanish Sage, talk about me just trying to become a better bead worker, trying to make lines in the air, trying to make beadwork do what it really hasn't done that much before, trying to take it away from the only idea that it is handicraft or decorative art and turn it into the same kind of aesthetic or ethical process that you do when you're painting or you're making prints. Because I think it's the same, but to be critiqued in that way and to sell it for that kind of artwork, you have to make the work as of the caliber, and you also have to, at least I have to say to myself, that's what I'm doing. Things that just are beautiful. The piece on, I think that's the piece on the left I gave to Michelle Obama. I'm you know, waiting with bated breath to see her, you know, picking cotton on the front lawn. I'm sorry, vegetables on the front lawn. Or running around, I really just said that too, didn't I? Or running around doing something with kids in school with my big ass necklace on. But the other thing I wanted to show you was this lavender necklace, because when I made that in my studio around 2 years ago, I had an epiphany, or what we'd say in Ebonics, an epiphany, because I never made that exact necklace before. And this opened something up for me for you as students. If I could give you, and that is because I'm a great person, but if I were smart, if I could sell you something for a reasonable price and bottled, you know, you wouldn't get sick or anything. If I could give you something fabulous, it would be the ability to have been doing your artwork for over 30 years and still be amazed in the studio. The fact that I could still be working and all of a sudden something new and unique and different makes me happy that I'm still doing this. That I still have the ability to charm and to charm myself, to be charmed by this work. I'm still in love with what I do. I've done a lot of work, a lot of sculpture. You saw my earlier work was so sculptural, and I'd done what in the 70s was called soft sculpture. That I kept doing sculpture when I was doing sculptural jewelry. And it's, you know, socially, politically directed. The piece on the left is called Nanny Now, Nigger Later. Yes, I still say the N-word and not say the N-word. Well, my mom said the most hurtful thing to her was to raise a white kid from infancy, be everything to it except a wet nurse, and when it was old enough to be called a nigger. Now, if she's been with that baby that long, that means she's been with the people in the house that long. And where would that child hear that word? I mean, it's still within a lexicon. Two more nanny pieces. The one on the right is called Husband. That's my husband. So she's holding up a ambrotype of a white guy from the turn of the century, and that brown figure behind her apron is their child. The other one, I think, is called Family Matters, and it's where this boy, who's had this nanny who has been not gold, but platinum to him, has done everything, is now at an age where he has to decide who she really is to him. And you know, that's an incredible burden to place on someone. And she is African American because I'm African American, but she could have been Hispanic, Asian, Irish, you name it. It's an enormous burden to place on a really young child to figure out what love is because of someone's ethnicity. The piece on this side would be your left is called Tracy. Once again, I'm just trying to draw in the air. I'm trying to make beadwork do something differently than it's done in the past. The other one is a really large piece, around 45 inches tall, called The Many Faces of Love. Self-love, ethnic love, love of life, love of death. The yellow piece, I don't know why I made it. I don't know why they're orange things and what. I just know that I wanted to, and it felt really good. I started using African sculpture in this work because it's what, so ethnicity many times is what supports the body. I'm black, I'm this, I'm that. So the arms and the legs are the history of this person on the right. And that's the beginning of my anthology, my ancestor progeny series where your grandparents couldn't choose you and you couldn't choose them. Howdy Doody on crack. Some of you don't even know Howdy Doody. Is that? Was he a politician or something? No, he was a really famous puppet. Well, that could be a politician, couldn't it? But that's a whole other thing. Life is a Tree. This one's around 36 inches tall. Blown glass. I've been doing glass for a really long time. I do not blow the glass. I go in and direct my gaffers. This one I did in Tacoma, Washington. What's their kit called? Well, they broke this up into maybe 40 different grids, and you got called a certain name and you had a certain place in society. Now that's a lot of work. I'm going to go back. And the other piece on the right is called You Have to Make New Jokes Because African Americans Are Not the Largest Minority Anymore. So what we're doing is passing on the mantle of stereotypes to our Hispanic brothers and sisters. That glass skirt has a person in a boat on it. The piece on the left is called Gunshot. I never understood why you would call a shot of whiskey a shot. When I bought this whiskey kind of container in North Carolina, I realized that it's a bottle that's a gun and you drink from it. And then I started, doing research, and guys used to put whiskey in the barrel of their gun and drink out of it, i.e. shot. And the other one, which was damaged and doesn't exist anymore, is called Have You Ever Met a White Person Named Washington? Very few statistically exist. They're mostly African American. I also started doing work about the assault and slaughter of African albinos. They're considered by some to be exotic animals, so they cut them up and use their body parts in different rituals. This is a flayed African. Now, I want you to keep seeing through all of my work, and this for me is a very good example. No matter what the social issue, it does not consume the quality of my artwork. I'm very proud of that face. That's a flayed, skinned face. It really is around that big. And even projected that large, it and its penis has power, because I never forgot that I was making artwork, not just a political statement. That is when it is the strongest. Okay, I'm trying to get, yeah. This started as just that head. That is a decapitated albino. And all of the cornrows are dimensional. And then I decided to attach it to a glass kind of hood. So this is now pretty large. We like to talk about Darfur and other places, but the women being used as fodder in a war are everywhere. So the piece on the right is Day After Rape, Bosnia. The piece next to it is the guy who raped her. It's like the devil made me do it. He's holding a red penis. And then I've done a whole series called The Day After Rape, which are small pieces, many of them you can hold in your hand. In parts of Africa, women are raped. Sometimes they're mutilated. They're placed at the side of the road in very strange and odd contortions, so that when people see them, they're very frightened. Sometimes it's done in front of their children. In the old days, I don't know if they're still doing it, old days meaning maybe 10 years ago, they would come upon a small village on camels, set it afire, and assault the people. So the one on the right is a small kid who's just left with his mom's head. This is the first one I did, which is Day After Rape, Darfur, and you can hold her in your hand. So it's not the size of something that brings import. It's the quality of the work. I went to a friend's house whose grandfather had died, and I was buying things, and he had a box full of pipes, and I thought, that's a thigh and a leg. And what would a man put in his mouth, which can be sexual? So these are also Day After Rape pieces. The piece on the right is the woman who is so contorted by the experience, and she is larger, maybe like 12 inches long. Gathering water. Same figure. One way to relieve my angst about this is, of course, to make the artwork, but another one is to make healing or spiritual pieces like this piece, which is called an Nkisi, a vestibule, a place where you can log in your dreams, wishes, prayers, and receive something from it. Made out of glass and coral. The piece on the left is from my Ancestry Progeny series. She has the European, what are Japanese crockery, little crockery pieces from Japan, arms and African legs, and she has the kind of little African girl body in red. Then the piece on the right is one of my latest black blonde pieces. You know, being a blonde is supposedly pretty amazing, but there are very few natural blondes, and when people around the world realize that you could become beautiful and a blonde from a bottle, then you got everybody being blondes, i.e. me, and I just got this in a box, so I could be lots of things. From the Ancestry Progeny series, I just started doing what I thought were funny things with the idea of mixing black people and white people together in different situations. The piece on the right are the grandparents looking at their Rasta ganja smoking grandson. The really smaller piece is a very prim group, possibly at a tea party, and there's a copulating interracial couple in the middle of them. And do they see that, or, you know, is that what they're thinking? This all started with that little Aunt Jemima, the small crockery pieces that a friend brought me, and it was holding a rolling pin that was a really poorly executed rolling pin, but I thought a white penis there would make sense. And then the other, I started doing a lot of collecting of these little crockeries. They're little Japanese, you know, pre-war and post-war pieces, and there he is. He was originally holding a flute, and now he is sucking on a black penis. I'm just playing around. Oh, and wait, what I forgot to say is these little pieces are from a series called Still Funny. I think they're funny as hell. Do we have the ability to laugh at things that are uncomfortable for us? And in laughing at them, are we examining them? You know how you just like, this is not funny. I just saw, as I was looking for Outkast's Hey Ya, you know, because you're working on a computer and you want that kind of music. And remember Andre 3000 he's like playing all the different parts and his hey, hey ya. So I'm looking, and Chris Rock has one called Crackers. Crackers. Has no rhythm, he's playing all the parts. And there's a part in Hey Ya where it says, shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it like a Polaroid picture, right? Well, Chris Rock says, shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it like they called you a nigga. And I'm like, this is so wrong and so funny. That's what I'd like you to think about when you see these pieces. So there, you know, in Maryland, in large East Coast cities, African Americans and Asians, and I should specifically talk about the Asian folks who own corner stores, maybe laundries in black neighborhoods, have had some problems, and many times it's just because they're just two very different cultures. And if you think about possibly a Korean or a Southeast Asian person who doesn't speak English very well, and they know certain words, and they don't maybe touch you when they give you your money, and then a brother and sister who comes in with Ebonics asking for, you can see that there could be possibly. Or think about Ebonics trying to do Yakashonja, Yakame, Ekpuyang, and well, I'm talking about the schism between the two. So there's a very old on your left little Japanese pot with a black person popping out. And then the other is the idea about either Pocahontas or like the Indian maiden in a boat. And these are all very, very small. Then we go to larger pieces. The red piece is like 5 feet by 5.5 feet, and it's made out of large plastic beads. I actually was going to make one of those as a rug because Sonia Clark, who's a fabulous artist, was at my house as we were talking, and I put it on the floor for her to look at when I was working on it, and she walked on it by mistake. And I'm like, oh, no, you didn't. You just walked on my artwork. And then I was like this, you just walked on that artwork. Huh. The other is a wall hanging that's not as large as projected, but it's probably half that size, made out of very small beads. I was trying to figure out a way to press what I do into jewelry, into light pieces. I'm going to be doing a residency at the McCall Center in Charlotte, North Carolina, at the beginning of next year, where I'm going to be mixing my beadwork with fused glass and doing stained glass and painting together, because I want, once again, light to happen in the work. Back to ancestry, I can't even say it, ancestry, progeny, those little European arms and legs, a pretty dress, and then that head. And that's a small piece, probably only around 8, 9 inches tall. So if that's true, that head's got to be really small, but you see how expressive it is. So as a teacher, I have to say to you that the quality of your work is very, very important. The piece on the, I see that there's an image twice, we can get rid of that. The piece on the right-hand side is African sculptures, and this time it's a white face with a little boy's clothing. Piece on the left is something that I made from my artwork. When a piece doesn't sell, or you get it in a gallery and you're looking at it like, this should never have left my studio. Please, God, don't let it sell. Don't let it sell. Please, God, don't let it sell. And for an artist to say, please don't let it sell, it must not be a successful work. So then I just take these pieces and cut them up, and eventually I'll use them. The piece on the right is another Inkisi. When I went to New Orleans to be doing stuff in the Biennale, in the Prospect 2 Biennale, I went early and worked at Inferno, which is a glass studio, and had them cast penises, fingers, and eyes for me. Let me give you this penis story since Dr. Hammond is here. So I'm doing this print residency at Tacoma, Washington, and they asked Leslie to come down and talk about me. And when they come, I said, look, I found this botanica, this bodega, this Hispanic store that has great candles and all kinds of things that we both collect. And they go there. Do you think she brings me back metal milagros or something for the wall? She brings me a big black penis candle, which we then played with for the rest of my residency. But I sent that to them to cast, expecting them to say something. And they're like, oh, we get penises all the time. Okay. This piece is probably, it's over 2 feet tall, weighs a ton. It's my cast work, it's beadwork, and those faces are my beadwork that have been trapped between glass. I just came back from Murano, Italy, where I was doing a residency. Now, this was really hilarious because my translator became sick the first day I was working. So it was me doing the artwork, a guy who swore he spoke English, which he didn't, and Marco, my gaffer, the guy doing glass for me. And so when, and these were, I never, you know how you, as an African-American, you're like, you know what your stereotype is. Well, these guys were really living up to some of the stereotypes that you see in movies about Italian men, and they wouldn't listen to me, and I would say, do this gently like a woman, and they would throw shit around. So I had this one guy named Marco, and when he wouldn't do what I said, and there was no one with English, I would just go up. Because, you know, you may not think you're doing this, but you realize that you are in some way summoning the blackness of yourself. But I mean the uber blackness. I mean the sparks of blackness. Where all of a sudden I did this. Marco! I didn't know my hands hit. And he said, Babene, Babene. So you better be doing that Babene shit. Okay. This is actually one of the works that I did with Marco. This is called Water Mammy 1. It's very large. This is around 35 inches long. So it's beadwork at the top, that blown figure. Now, Marco, I found out later, was not the maestro. He was really learning, so he couldn't figure out how to do the bottom right, which then they just throw stuff away. I'm like, no, you don't throw anything away. I'll use it. And generally when I do things that are upside down, that means distress. Beadwork beaded on a glass rod. Those are sperms that are holding up the rod, and a very empty guy. And he also has genitalia, which was hilarious to make. And I'll tell you later, maybe I'll do my dirty story later about it, because I wasn't exactly, it's been so long, I wasn't exactly sure where it was supposed to be placed. And this is the piece I did with Daniello, who was the maestro. And he kept seeing the stuff we were doing, and he came back and said, I ought to do that. So I gave them this African sculpture, and he copied it. And then we inserted a baby being born, and then I used this base and made figures here in the United States. And this piece is 45 inches tall. And those two pieces are in the Italian show at the Museum of Art and Design that opens on March the 5th. Now, when you are doing collaborative work like this, you have to really submit to the abilities of the person you're collaborating with, or to their ideas. So this figure started off, even the wooden figure was, you know, African was kind of thin. And I'm like, no, brother, look at me. And he's like, okay, brother. Because people usually don't go up and squeeze themselves in front of them because they're very polite. I've done a lot of installation art in my life. This I did at the Spoleto Arts Festival, I think in the 80s. And what's very interesting in my showing you this, because this is around 15 to 17 feet tall, made on the skeleton of the old art museum. And when I called the Hysterical Black History Society and said, I want to use this space, they said, why? They didn't want us in there before. And I said, well, that's a good reason to use it. And they said, huh? And I said, well, that's why I'm going to use it. Then I had a retrospective at the Baltimore Museum of Art in 2000, and I got to use the Thinker. When I was a child, the Thinker used to be on the outside of the building, and I, like other young kids, would crawl all over him and look for his genitalia and just do things. Well, years later, they allowed me to use him, but when I said it, they did this. No. I said, why? Rodin is dead. They're like, no. The only way you can do this is to find the context. So I got together with one of the curators because I knew that there was a reason why I wanted to use it. And the Pennsylvania Academy in Philadelphia has Rodin doors, and right at the very top is the Thinker guarding these doors of hell. So on top of this Thinker is a small boy who's been lynched. He's so permeated with stereotypes that they're popping out of his body. Words like nigger spit, kike, and yid, and his bones and watermelon. Now, this may seem extreme, but while we're installing this, kids are coming up to me, and their teachers don't think they know what's happening. They say everything to the surprise and sometimes chagrin of their teachers. I was asked to be one of the artists in a sculpture show at Evergreen House here, and they kept talking about this tree. I think it was the acacia tree, how it comes into a neighborhood, grows over everything, nobody likes it, it's not that good looking. I said, well, you know, it sounds like you're talking about people. So when you cut those trees down, give me some. We tricked them up and replanted them. And my whole point is no matter who you are or what you are, it's all right. It's okay to be alive. You are beautiful. Now, why am I showing you this piece? This was the installation that I did at the Prospect 2 in New Orleans in 2011. It's much larger than life size. It is hanging in the tree. It has blown glass flames coming from its neck. It's all beadwork. And the reason why I was in that show is because Dan Cameron, who was the curator and the person who started Prospect 2, saw my artwork 20 years ago in South Carolina at the Spoleto Festival. Never exactly knew how to use me, but 20 years later he did. Which means when you decide to be in art shows and you don't get in, or you look at something and say, I shouldn't try this, You should, because you never know who's looking at your work. I've been a printmaker for a while. Remember when the teacher told me to not paint because blah, blah? Well, I thought at least I should start with prints because I can paint on prints, and then I keep going to galleries and museums and seeing what I consider to be really crappy painting. And if I'm a really crappy painter and crappy paintings are selling, I should start painting again. I went to Tampa and I did a series called the Sexecution series. I started saving images of these cats, you know, grabbing your genitalia. I just loved them so much. I would date one of them. I'm allergic to cats. That's how deeply involved with these cats I would be. Well, they were the funny side of this Sexecution series. When I was standing in the line at a Safeway, I saw one of those magazines. Somebody had torn all of the plastic off of it. And it's produced by African-American men about African-American women's big butts. This is a woman who's part Trinidadian, part Ethiopian. She is gorgeous. And her measurements are something like 36, 20 something, 40. And in this mag, they're just talking about her butt and stuff like that. And when you read what she says, she doesn't say, and this is from an old cranky feminist, you don't hear things like, I'm gonna take this money and open up my own magazine. I'm gonna take this money and open up a shop for big butted pants. She just says, I don't want to have a baby right away. So I realized that all of these eyes are upon her. And to me, it's also, as I talk to my godkids and younger people, sometimes we might talk about this, it's sort of like the execution or the end of the kind of romance that old folks like, you know, at last, my love has come along. Sometimes I think, of course, Mary J. Blige sings about it, and Keisha, who I think needs to have a couture class, she should come to the Maryland Institute Arts Fashion Department for help. That's all I have to say about her. But, you know, people are talking about, I love him, he's got to hit it and quit it, and blah. I'm like, okay. I think kind of romance is gone. It's also the idea that women are such sexual objects that when guys or other women who like them are looking at them, they become so immersed in that person that their eyes become eyes and their nose become eyes and the lips become eyes and just their ears are eyes. They just can't get enough. But if it's the end of this love, then she's actually in the room in the prison where they execute you, they give you shots. I don't really know a lot about these. I just knew I really had to do them. And they're silk screens with hand painting. That I did in Tacoma, Washington, while Leslie's bringing me a big Dick candle. It was a unique time. And I've been a performer for a long time. I used to perform with Kayla Wall. We would call the Thunder Thigh Review. For obvious reasons, I no longer have to wear black lace stockings. The cellulite on my body looks exactly the same. The pattern is the same now. We're going to do a reunion at the Theater Project this year. This is the 40th anniversary of the Theater Project, and it would probably be our 30th anniversary. I also worked with a group called Honey Child Milk. Donald Byrd was our director, and Donald Byrd just received a USA Artist Fellowship. He's in Seattle now. He was a choreographer for a long time. And we did coon shows. People didn't know they were coon shows until we tell really horrible jokes, right? And that's where I developed this character called Rodney Dangerous in the Field, the first stand-up comic. I don't get no respect. If this ain't working, I don't get no respect. Well, people would know we were doing coon shows until we would like maybe be singing, because we had a really fabulous writer and librettist, and we might be singing a song like this. I hope I live to see you again in Coonsville. What? But that wasn't the biggest risk for me, and that is what I'm after in my visual and performing work. And I'm such a bad writer, risk is always a possibility for me. It's risk. It's being able to stand up on my own and produce something that's going to involve you, that's going to enthrall you, that's going to make you like it or hate it, that's going to make you take something home instead of a snooze. So I did a series of one-person performances, and I did something in New Orleans, but the great part about that is that I wrote a bunch of original music, and I had true New Orleans musicians and singers work with me. And of course, the end picture is me and my mom. And I'm going to end with a little bit of Etta James. At last, my true love has come along, and my lonely days are over, and my life is just a song. Thanks.